Hi, let's look at the baroreceptor reflex. This is a fun one. I always like these neural reflexes. So, first slide. Let's start with a review of a neural reflex loop. This was back from Biology 241 when we were doing nervous system. So we looked at a nervous reflex loop in terms of like 5 separate anatomical pieces, if you will. Not all reflexes are conveniently described this way, but functionally they all work the same. But on a nice, neat neural reflex like the baroreceptor reflex, it works pretty well. So we'll just do it in order. And what we're describing is this loop. It's a feedback loop. So if we're going to detect something, we need to have a receptor. If you're going to monitor blood pressure, if the body's going to monitor blood pressure, it has to have blood pressure receptors somewhere to check what the blood pressure is doing. And it sends that information through a sensory pathway to an integration center. So these are sensory neurons. You can just call it a sensory pathway or a sensory path. And it goes to an integration center where lots of different information gets integrated. Not just information from the baroreceptors or any other receptor, but other inputs as well. It integrates that information, decides, if you will, on what to do, and then it sends signals out through nerves, and these would be motor neurons. We'll just call it a motor pathway or a motor path. And it goes out to some sort of effector. So those 5 pieces. And the effector is what causes the response. So, for example, the baroreceptor reflex is for regulating blood pressure very quickly. So when there's a stress, such as a drop in blood pressure, that drop in blood pressure is detected by the receptors, and it sends that information from the receptor into the integration center, and that processes the information quickly and sends it out to effectors to cause a response. And what do we want to do to close this loop? We want to raise the blood pressure. So we start with a stress of a drop in blood pressure. Through negative feedback, we're going to wind up increasing blood pressure. And that completes the loop. We had a drop, we're losing homeostasis. We increase blood pressure, we're back to homeostasis. That's the idea. So let me point out that this baroreceptor reflex is very fast. It's neural. We don't have to wait for hormones to circulate around through the bloodstream and try to find a target receptor. It's neural. It's going straight to the targets. And this reflex will complete this loop in about 3 beats of the heart. That's pretty quick. So the baroreceptor reflex is an important one that I want you to know well, and we will go through it. Okay, so to introduce it, in the figure on the right, we have to detect the blood pressure. Well, the best place to check the pressure of a system is close to the pump. So the heart is the pump. So the receptors are close to it. And the baroreceptors are placed in the aortic arch. So there are these aortic bodies. We'll come back to those. Let me write that in there, and I'll come back to it. And also, there are baroreceptors in the carotid arteries, at the carotid sinus. So, well, this is kind of a nice introduction to what I'm going to ask you to know, and I need to put some slides out to indicate which vessels I want you to know. But you should already be able to identify, so this is a little bit of a side trip here, a side note. You should be able to identify that blood vessel and the other two blood vessels. There's that one, and then there is also this one. And those are the three branches off the aorta. So that's a bit of a diversion, but I just saw that and thought I would point that out. Because as we go through this course, hopefully connections get made and more pieces kind of fall in together. And here is the carotid sinus, which is a swelling, and there are carotid bodies and the carotid bodies and the aortic bodies contain a number of sensory receptors, baroreceptors being one of them. No, geez. Bodies. Little clumps of cells. Okay, well that's where the baroreceptors are. Baro, of course, is for pressure. These are pressure receptors, and they are sending sensory information through a couple of different nerves, the glossopharyngeal and the vagus, cranial nerve 10 and 9. You may not have had to learn the glossopharyngeal number 9, but I think you all learned the vagus. At any rate, that carries sensory information into the medulla. And this is going into our cardioregulatory center. You remember the nuclei in the cardioregulatory center? It's in the medulla. So we're not doing the vascular, so we're kind of restricting, we're looking at a part of the cardiovascular control center. We're essentially looking at the cardio control center, or the cardioregulatory center. And those two nuclei were the acceleratory center and the inhibitory center. So there's the integration that occurs. Integration is in the CNS, in the medulla, and then the output. Well, there are two outputs. Let's do the sympathetic output first. So these are the sympathetic chain ganglia. So that's where our synapse occurs, even though it's not shown. And the output goes back to the heart. And it goes to the SA node, and it goes to the AV node, and it goes to the myocardium. And I have another diagram that we'll do in the next slide where we can hopefully put a little more detail into the picture. So this will increase heart rate and FOC, force of contraction. The parasympathetic pathway is going to take the brakes off of the heart. So you take the brakes off of the heart, that will help it speed up, and you increase the sympathetic stimulation to the SA node, the AB node, and the heart rate will increase. So let's go to the next slide and try to clean this up a little bit. Oh, I forgot. Before we go to the next slide, let's look at some other general factors that affect blood pressure. Now, I'm going to go out of order here. Let's stick with the baroreceptor reflex. We'll come back to slide 31. Let's do the practice of the baroreceptor reflex while it's fresh. So we're going to think in terms of your reflex response loop. We need 5 pieces, 5 different things. So we'll start with the stress. And in this case, it's going to be orthostatic hypotension. So look it up. Orthostatic hypotension is low blood pressure. Ortho is referring to the skeleton, and static is not moving, so it's basically when you stand up. So orthostatic hypotension is what happens when you're lying down and then you stand up quickly and you feel a little lightheaded. You feel a little woozy. What happens is that when you stand up, the gravity pulls blood out of your brain and your brain is temporarily starved for oxygen. It's that sensitive to oxygen levels. So the baroreceptor reflex kicks in and you raise the blood pressure quickly and the sense of wooziness goes away and you are maintaining homeostasis. So let's look at that reflex. And I don't know why I drew such a small heart in this figure. Be that as it may, let's start with our stress. So let's put in our baroreceptors in the carotid sinus. And we also have baroreceptors in the aorta, in those aortic bodies. And let's send nerves from those receptors and we'll get them out of the picture. So these are sensory nerves, sensory pathways. So remember, stress with a drop in blood pressure. That's what starts this. The baroreceptors detected. And this is our integration center in the CNS, in the medulla. The medulla oblongata, to be correct. And then we have motor pathways that are leaving, And let's do a sympathetic. First neuron is short, second neuron is longer. And we are going to the contractile myocardium, we're going to the AV node, we're going to the SA node, maybe something like that. I better move that into the getting a little crowded, but we've already done that with the electrical conduction system. So let's just put the targets over here. The SA node, the AV node, and the myocardium. And that will cause an increase in heart rate and increase in force of contraction. So this was a sympathetic path. And you remember, I hope so, the neurotransmitter that's released. Okay, sorry about that. This recording got interrupted by an unfortunate phone call. I didn't have my phone off. So I'm going to edit out, or by the time you see this, I've edited out the interruption. And I'm coming back and I don't remember where I left off or where the phone call came in. So I think we'll do another slide after this to practice. So what I had drawn was the sensory side of it, from the receptors to the integration center, and we were drawing the motor output. Sympathetic. The other motor piece is the parasympathetic. And the point that I'd like you to remember is that the parasympathetic is actively slowing the heart down. So this is a parasympathetic pathway. And it is going back to the heart, and it's too crowded to draw in this diagram. But the parasympathetic is normally slowing the heart down, so this pathway decreases, so there are fewer action potentials, so there's a decrease in the frequency of the action potentials to the heart. Oops, and it's essentially breaks off. And the heart speeds up. Okay, the only other thing in this diagram, which technically isn't part of the baroreceptor reflex, are the blood vessels. So let's just put that in here so we're clear on what else is happening. So we need to raise blood pressure, so we're going to vasoconstrict the blood vessels. Again, it's a sympathetic pathway to blood vessels, and here we are still releasing norepinephrine, and on the vascular smooth muscle the receptors are alpha. Alpha receptors. And the response would be increased vasoconstriction. And that will increase blood pressure also. All right, I'm going to go to another slide, and let's see if we can clean this up a little bit. So let's make a bigger heart. One that we can draw in. chambers. And here's the brain. And the spinal cord, cerebellum, that sort of thing. So that's our CNS. And let's put in our receptors. So our baroreceptors are, again, in the carotid arteries and in the aortic arch. So those are the baroreceptors. And let's draw a sensory pathway. It's one neuron off to the CNS. So again, sensory. And this is through or via the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10. And if this is our stress again, is a drop in blood pressure. Stress equals a drop in BP. Maybe it's orthostatic hypotension. It could be anything else that causes the blood pressure to drop. It could be a loss of blood fluid or blood volume, hemorrhaging. So then we'll draw our motor. So this is again the integration center. I'll abbreviate INTEG center in the medulla. And we have output, sympathetic, and it is going to go to the SA node, the AV node, and the contractile myocardium. And in all cases, the sympathetic pathway, it's an adrenergic fiber, neuron. So it's releasing norepinephrine. And norepinephrine. And all of the receptors are beta 1 receptors. So norepinephrine is binding to beta 1 receptors on the heart. And that will lead to an increase in heart rate and increase in force of contraction, and that leads to increased blood pressure, cardiac output. But that's what we were after. The other motor pathway is the parasympathetic pathway through the cranial nerve 10 again. So it's running with the vagus. It's going in this direction. Probably should have used a different color. And it is going primarily to the SA node. And the neurotransmitter at that point, again, is ACH. The receptor is a muscarinic receptor, which I'm abbreviating at that synapse. If we're going to put the blood vessels back in, it looks sort of something like this. There's a blood vessel, and here is another sympathetic pathway to the blood vessel. And we are again releasing norepinephrine. but this time the receptor is an alpha receptor. And the response is to increase vasoconstriction. And that will lead to an increase in the blood pressure. So again, a very fast neural feedback loop for raising blood pressure, the baroreceptor reflex. You need to practice this. Make sure your phones are off, unlike mine. Okay, so I hope that helps. Let's go back now and look at the final slide. This one. It's a little out of order in the way that I printed them, but that's okay. So, other factors that influence blood pressure. A little larger picture. So there are multiple inputs, and we have an integration center in the middle of the diagram that's taking information from the inputs. So we have looked at baroreceptors that will supply information to the brain on what is happening to pressure in the vascular system. If it drops, we need to increase it. There are also chemoreceptors. So if they detect high levels of CO2, we'll get them back to that when we do the respiratory system. That will influence heart rate. And proprioceptors also, stretch receptors, motion receptors in joints, tendons. When those are active, the brain knows that the body is moving and heart rate will increase. And then we also have higher brain centers. So we've talked about before, fear, anxiety, anticipation can act in a feed-forward sense to influence blood pressure. The outputs from the integration center, we've already talked about SA node, AV node, and myocardium, and the response of those would be to increase heart rate, cardiac output. We've talked about vascular smooth muscle and how that raises blood pressure. We haven't really talked yet about the adrenal medulla and RAS. Kidneys are in the next section of lecture, and that might be the last unit. So we'll come back and talk about these in another unit. Let's say C, last lecture. Okay, I hope that was helpful. And sorry about the phone call interruption. I don't know how I'm going to edit that, but hopefully it won't be too much of a distraction. So, see you next time. Bye.